So we have the pleasure of having here today with us Jean-Louis Cohen, who is in fact doing an exhibition in Casa da Arquitetura in Porto, and
Let's say so.
that we are all going to see for sure. Well, Jean-Louis Cohen needs no introduction for many of you that are here today, but because there are also some students from the first year of the course, I think that it would be enough to say that he's one of the greatest architectural critics and historians in the world today. He was trained as an architect and art historian and holds since 1994 the Sheldon Solom Chair for the History of Architecture at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, and in 2014 has been appointed to the first Chair of Architecture at the Collège de France. He has published more than 30 books, including many that you certainly know, France, Modern Architectures in History, Le Corbusier's Atlas of Modern Landscapes, The Future of Architecture Since 1889, Architecture in Uniform, and Le Corbusier and the Mystique of the USSR. And among the numerous exhibitions he has curated feature the centennial show L'Aventure Le Corbusier at the Centre Georges Pompidou, Architecture in Uniform at the Canadian Centre of Architecture, and Le Corbusier, an Atlas of Modern Landscapes at the Museum of Modern Art. And in fact, all these publications and exhibitions have as common denominator the sharp critical sense that leads Jean-Louis Cohen to dismantle a set of false clear ideas on which the construction of the history of modern architecture has been based. Jean-Louis Cohen has been, above all, an inspiration for young researchers and who find in his enormous curiosity, intelligence, and perspicacy a source of inexhaustible breadth. And I'm sure you will feel the same with the research that is going to be presented here today. Jean-Louis Cohen has been dedicated in recent years to a unique work, that of the publication of the catalogue Raisonné of drawings by Frank Gehry, one of the most relevant architects at the moment, where this architect's work is critically presented, exploring not only the basis of his conceptual thinking, but his progression from paper architecture to post-structuralism. So overtaking the commonplace about the impossibility of seriously referring to contemporary production or about living authors, Jean-Louis Cohen has been overcoming the traditional research on architecture as well as the alienation in relation to living authors, while not missing the opportunity to dismantle a series of clear false ideas about them. So the invention of an architect, how Los Angeles shaped Frank Gehry, is the title of this lecture. In fact, it is generally assumed that Frank Gehry's architecture is objectual and that it does not establish a close linkage with its context. This conviction is fostered by both its innovative and disruptive character, as well as by how it has been presented in architectural books, magazines, and journals. However, it is clear that Gehry himself remarks, and I'm quoting, "When people photograph my buildings, they usually crop the context." Through unprecedented research based on insightful archival analysis, but also on a fruitful interaction with the author himself, Jean-Louis Cohen reveals precisely the opposite, setting aside certain preconceived ideas which underpin the work of one of the most important architects of the turn of the century. Cohen finally demonstrates that urban dimension has been continuously part of Gehry's creative process since the late 70s, and that his works not only do not establish a rupture with its surroundings, but it can be fully understood precisely from a contextual perspective. So it remains for me finally to thank Jean-Louis Cohen for his generosity in accepting this challenge of coming to the Autonomous University of Lisbon in the context of the PhD program on contemporary architecture to exchange ideas with us. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Marta. It's always, I don't know if there is an echo or not, it's always very strange to hear oneself being introduced. It looks like if you were hearing your funeral oration while still above the ground. Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. As I've just told in an interview to Ruchi and Marta, doctoral education in architecture has been really a big fight for me ever since the 1980s. Visiting American programs, getting a PhD when when it was totally useless and even counterproductive for your career as a teacher. It was dangerous. You were considered as a risky intellectual. And then creating a joint program of several schools of architecture in France in the early 90s, which trained maybe 100 doctors who are all teaching in various places of the world today. So I've been very engaged in this, in what I consider a key component of architectural culture in general, to be able to produce a structural, legitimate, sometimes even scientific discourse on this wonderful practice. So anyway, today I want to give an account of work which has started many years ago and which has no visible end. These images are not very large. I hope you can read them anyway. In 1981, I went for my first trip to the United States of America. I had an intense desire to go there, study with Louis Cohen, like some of my friends, or simply discover America, but my passport was stamped with red ink. I was, until the late 70s, a very active member of the French Communist Party, and I could not get a visa, a proper visa. So when François Mitterrand was elected, socialist president in 1981, this ban was dropped, and I took the first plane to New York and Los Angeles. I was attracted by LA because I had read Rainer Banhaus's fantastic book, Los Angeles, An Architecture for Ecologies, in which, by the way, he published a photograph of an early building by Gehry. So I was mesmerized by LA. And when I came back, I published an article on the house as a manifesto, in which I compared the house of Charles and Ray Eames in Pacific Palisades on the left with the house Frank Gehry had just completed in Santa Monica on the right. During this trip, I met Gehry, and who had lots of times, and we shared the knowledge of some interesting people he had met in Paris. I will get back to this in a minute, in some minutes. We shared some joint friends, and we became extremely good friends in 1981. So the story, my engagement in this year-long project on Gehry's oeuvre, as they say in the US, is born out of this early encounter with the still young Gehry, and it has not ended to this day. And for me, this essay comparing the two houses was a sort of opening moment, which brings us to Gehry and why Gehry among all the living architects. It's clear, I think you should have a larger screen one day. I think that Gehry is arguably one of the most provocative architects of this generation. It's not a coincidence if he was featured in the famous advertising campaign of Chight and Day, a publicity firm for which he built this. Is there a pointer? No? The pointer doesn't work on the screen. So you see on the right his portrait on the side wall of a building he did for this advertising agency, which was invented the slogan for Apple computers, think different. And you see on the left people who were considered as thinking different, from Picasso to Einstein. Gehry was one of them, thinking differently. And it's true that he has thought differently and recast our perception of a series of building types. I'll take two obvious examples, two banal examples in his work. The domestic program, the house, he has taught us to see what a house could be in a very different manner, and also the museum with Bilbao. So Gehry has not only worked with new form, but has fundamentally challenged the programs he had touched. So the project I'm engaged with started a few years ago and has led yet to the publication of one volume out of 8 of a catalogue of Gehry's sketches, since Gehry is someone who draws. So when the publisher of Cahiers d'Art, whom you see on the left, Staffan Arenberg, you see Gehry and me in Gehry's office, when we met with Arenberg, it was an interesting conversation. Arenberg is the publisher of a journal called Cahiers d'Art, which was created in the 1920s by Christian Zervos, and for decades it published essays on architecture, art, primitive art, cinema, until the 1960s. Zervos, who was behind the organization, this is an interesting anecdote for architects, of the 1933 SIAM conference in Athens, in Greece. Zervos started in the 30s to publish a catalogue raisonné of Picasso's paintings. And when Arenberg, whose father has commissioned Le Corbusier a floating museum in Stockholm, by the way, so there are lots of stories in the story, Arenberg, we had a conversation with him, and he said, what if we were doing a big catalogue raisonné on a contemporary architect? And we started thinking, and we said, okay, there are two options, because there are only two architects of a high profile who are graphomaniac. One is Caesar, and the other one is Gehry. So in the end, he had a better knowledge of the American scene, so we went for Frank. And it worked immediately well with Frank. So here you have a view of what this book is. It's a very heavy book in which I'm scanning the work of Gehry from the beginning to this day, step by step, year by year. Another articulation like a typological one, houses, museums, office buildings, would have been meaningless. The archive is monstrous. This is something we can discuss later. And the only way of making my way in the archive, like a miner making his way in an underground vein of charcoal, was to go step by step. Hence, volume 1 is published. I've written volume 2, and it's going to be it's going into graphic design soon. Volume 3 is on its way, and then we'll see what comes next. So one important thing here is that this is a book, and it's important for me to underline that books are still relevant. And as a book, it's also a very beautiful one. It's not exactly a coffee table book. You put 4 legs and you have a coffee table by itself. And it's a story which starts, which is not exactly a biography, although there is a biographical component. So the story begins, which is condensed in the book. The story begins with a few notions about where Gehry comes from and how he met architecture. Gehry comes from a Jewish family, was born in Toronto, Canada, Ontario, Canada, which was a developing metropolis in the 1920s. He was born in a family of Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland, and had the initial name of Frank Goldberg, which was an obvious Jewish name. He changed his name in the early 50s, at the time in which Los Angeles, where his family has resettled in 1945, when Los Angeles, at the time of an intense war-related production, Los Angeles had become, during the war years, the third, number 3 Jewish city in the world, after New York, which was the first, Tel Aviv, which was the second, Los Angeles, probably almost more people than Tel Aviv. And so Gehry was in this milieu, but at the same time there was a sort of underlying anti-Semitism, and that's why his wife pushed him to change his name to Gehry. An amusing choice, which I have no time to discuss. So Gehry found himself in a very poor family. His father was sick, his mother was working as a saleswoman in a department store. He started his life in California by being a truck driver in a city which had been completely reshaped by World War II. The massive production of airplanes and boats, the transformation of the city with the development of the freeway network, which changed the city, which had been built with and by the streetcar, as Rainer Benham has demonstrated. Around 1914, Los Angeles had the largest, the longest streetcar networks in the world, 1,500 kilometers of streetcars, which were all made obsolete by the automobile industry in a sort of violent anti-rail campaign. So Los Angeles was changing with the cars. Los Angeles was also changing with a massive production of suburban houses fueled by the GI Bill of Rights, which gave returning war veterans money to buy small houses and to study in college. So the city was changed, so both morphologically, if you want, and culturally, and became also a polygon for experimental architecture. I will just mention briefly the case study houses program, which started in the post-war years with the idea of a very clever idea of John Entenza, on the right here with the IMSIs, Entenza, who developed a program which advertised the production of modern building components, asking radical architects to produce their experimental houses. So Gehry saw this program happening. He saw the work of some of the most imaginative Los Angeles architects emerging, as he was a curious student at school. I will go to his school years very briefly. He was interested, for instance, in the remarkable work of John Lautner, who was operated on the edge of architecture and engineering. And interestingly, in both cases here, we see two houses by Lautner, which were built for airplane engineers, aerospace engineers. And I'm just mentioning this because we have to also question how did Gehry, who had no cultural capital and no economic capital, who was coming out of nowhere with an architect's degree, how did Gehry get his clients? And he got them in this milieu of airplane engineers, and also largely in a milieu of Jews, despite his name change. It didn't fool anything. He was still not getting any other clients. Los Angeles was also of course, a place where the movie industry was booming at that time. And a very interesting thing, a provocative thing, is that you would have expected Gehry to be very receptive to cinema and to have responded to the cinema culture of Los Angeles in his architectural work. Yet there is nothing about or in relationship to cinema. And it is due, I question Frank, about that. How come you never reference cinema? You talk sometimes about literature. He says, each time I read Proust, I cry. He refers to art, sometimes to technology, never to cinema, and it was clearly a position he borrowed from his friend, the young artists of LA, who wanted to distantiate themselves from the cliché identifying Los Angeles with Hollywood and Mickey Mouse. So Gehry took the same position, no relationship to cinema. It's important sometimes to wonder not only what are, a term I deeply dislike, but let's use it provisionally, the influences. But it's also important to measure what are the non-influences. What are these disconnections between the work of architect and what surrounds him. So Gehry, as a truck driver, started meeting various people who told him he should go to college. And he went to the University of Southern California, where initially he studied art, and he studied art and discovered architecture. He studied art, and this is really interesting, with Glenn Lukens, who had been the pioneer of modern ceramics in Los Angeles, in California, in the early 1930s. So he started doing manual things. At the same time, was attracted to architecture through the work of people like Rafael Soriano, one of his teachers. Soriano had been a draftsman with Richard Neutra, and also through the work of forgotten architects like Calvin Straub at the bottom. Straub, who was the inventor of the sort of hybrid Californian-Japanese type of bungalows. And here, the presence of Japan in the work of Gehry is something really important. I will also mention it later. The young Californian architects were really focused on Asia. Several of them were drafted during the Cold War and the Korean War to serve in Japan. So they had a great knowledge of things Japanese. The teachers of Gehry were important people on the Los Angeles scene. One of them had been also associated with Neutra. His name was Gregory Ain. Gregory Ain worked at developing interesting low-cost workers' housing when Los Angeles was still considering that social housing was not a Bolshevik conspiracy. It very soon stopped. Ain worked also with Garrett Egbo, a fundamental source for Gehry's ideas and Gehry's position. Garrett Egbo was a landscape designer trained at Harvard who had worked intensely during the New Deal period in the US at trying to imagine what a sort of progressive landscape could be. And he had worked on the idea of a modern Californian landscape, modern Californian garden. You see on the right his beautiful book. He was a teacher at USC. Gehry was his teaching assistant. And Garrett Egbo was also very left-wing. And this is an important thing for Gehry, who shared his positions. Garrett Egbo ran into trouble because he had mentioned in one of his classes the execution of the Rosenbergs, who were considered as being Soviet spies and who had sold the atomic secrets of the US to Moscow. There were huge protests in the entire world, and now that the Soviet archives are open, we realize that what the left believed was wrong, that they were really spies. But anyway, Gehry was brought in this sort of leftist atmosphere, and this is also something that brought us together when we met in 1981. He watched the architecture around him, and here is a very important point I want to make about the education of architects. Architects are not educated only by education. You can't define what an architect is simply by the courses he took at school or the studios he made. There are two other very important sources. One is the mentors with whom an architect works off school at night in order to make money. The masters one selects or one discovers by chance. So the second source are architects with whom young people work. And the third source is even probably more important. It's what I would call the cultural bath in which one swims. The buildings one visits, the people one meets, the stimulus one gets from the build production. And in Los Angeles, there was a lot to see, in particular the work of Lautner here, the work of Schindler. Gehry became good friend with the old Schindler. He was taken, interestingly, to the sites of Schindler. And if you look at the Tischler house on the right and this work with a wooden frame, you see probably one of the sources of Gehry's interest for playing with the wooden frame, Schindler. He went to see Schindler's buildings with a photographer because he had befriended a photographer called Julius Schulman, who was the guy shooting the new buildings of Schindler and also those of Richard Neutra. So logically, both Schindler and Neutra were Jews, and logically, Gehry went to look for work at Neutra's office. And the story is well known but very funny. He had very nice drawings from school. He introduced his drawings to Neutra, and they left. And on the next Monday, Frank called Neutra saying, "Mr. Neutra, sorry, but we forgot to talk about money when we met." And Neutra says, "Very true. I don't know yet how much money. I will ask you to work for me." So he would have had to pay for his internship. It seems strange today, but it happens sometimes when architectural education was also a matter of apprenticeship. So they never worked together. So here we see on the left, top left, we see Schulman and Neutra on a building site, and we see how, it's interesting how Neutra guided the photography of Schulman. And we see also Gehry's first project out of the, when he was still at school, or finishing school. It's a bungalow for a friend, for the brother-in-law of Schulman, a guy called Julius Rom. You will see that it's a bungalow with a very, very flat roof, a T-shaped plan, rather inspired by Japanese architecture. Here is one of Gehry's senior projects at USC, a housing project in California, and we see a combination of many cliches of the American modernism of that time, in particular maybe the work of José Luis Sert, the concrete screens of Wright, who was a great source of reflection for Gehry. Here, Gehry's first built work, which took place, interestingly, in the context of his military service. He was drafted and worked with some of his friends at building the interior of an army club. So this is the only photo we have of this interior, which is interesting because of the use of wood and white beige surfaces, and can be referred to two sources. One is Japanese, again, the knowledge of Japan and the knowledge of Japanese way of building with wood and light partitions, and of course, the lighting fixtures, the use of indirect light is something that Gehry owes to Wright. He knew the work of Wright inside out. He had been an intern at the big show 60 Years of Living Architecture, which had been organized by Bruno Zevi first in Italy, in Florence, and then traveled back to the US. So he knew the work of Wright. He always said, "I knew everything, but I didn't want to meet him because of his reactionary politics." Then Gehry made a mistake. He went to Harvard University. He wanted to study urban design, the concrete design of urban space, and he he applied to the wrong program, urban planning, which he found totally boring. He met good people, and he ended up learning something about urban design, but it was not the best period for him in his training. The best period probably in his training, the decisive one, took place when he returned to Los Angeles. He had a brief stint, a brief period in the office of William Pereira, who was doing some grandiloquent, lyrical modernist design. In particular, Pereira designed the theme building of the Los Angeles airport. Gehry firmly denies he worked on this project, but he was at the office at the same time, so we'll never know the truth. And from Pereira, he moved always, and I'm not obsessed by that. I'm a totally secular atheist and anti-Zionist Jew, but still, the Jewishness of Gehry has had a very significant role. Pereira was Jewish, as was Victor Grun on the right, who was born in Vienna and had emigrated in the US in the 30s. And as you know, Grun developed the architecture and the very concept of the shopping mall and created a vast office working on shopping malls. So Gehry found himself in the office of Victor Grun, where he worked for several years and learned not only the way of the design of shopping malls, but he learned one very important thing, which was the collaborative dimension of architectural design. Not the collaborative notion promoted by Gropius, where the architect was a sort of group. As you know, Gropius developed this idea because he himself was unable to draw. So he has to theorize his inability to draw, camouflaging it into a theory of collaborative design. But Grun, the architects at Grun were the main designers, yet working with engineers, acousticians, graphic designers, landscape designers, mechanical engineers. So a practice of collaboration, which Gehry has kept to this day. In particular, the pair with the acoustician is something very important throughout all his projects, and not only the music-related ones. So he learned a way of practicing architecture at Grun. A sense also, very important, of the use of inexpensive materials in commercial architecture, which he has kept to this day. Gehry is not building with plated gold panels, but has always worked with inexpensive material. Even one of his very brief theoretical statements was about it. So Grun, and also some early projects which he did by himself. This log cabin, not log, but this wooden cabin, was an early project he did near Los Angeles. Before building his first house on a hill in the west of Los Angeles for the Steves. Steve was an accountant, and the house, as you see, develops horizontally over the cliff, and is a very widely spread out plan, cross-shaped plan, which includes many interior patios and many different types of views, which can be related if you look at the plan of Steve's on the left and the plan of one of Wright's prairie houses. It can really be related to the kind of spatial deployment of Wright's architecture. At the same time, there is also a sort of Japanese feel in the interior of the house, in the use of wood and stucco panels. There is also an input of Schindler's way of bringing different kinds of lights into the house. So this building had a certain recognition, was already published, and it was designed with a classmate of Gehry who had a very important role in probably 30 years of his activity. This classmate's name was Gregory Walsh. He was a regular American of Irish origin. Gehry and Walsh worked together, were classmates at USC, and one of the problems I met in my work was that they had taught each other to draw exactly in the same manner in order to fool their professors. So they could replace each other for the juries. And of course, this created me a big problem because I could not sometimes identify if drawings were in the immense archive were by Frank or by Greg. So I would go to Frank and tell him, Frank, this drawing is great. Is it yours? No, it's Greg. And I went to Greg the next day, who said, are you joking? It can only be by Frank. So, so this relativizes the notion of authorship. There was a shared manner. And in a way, Greg Walsh had a very important role in the life of interesting lapsus of Gehry. I would compare him to Pierre Jeanneret on the side of Le Corbusier. Without Greg Walsh keeping the office running, taking care of the kids who were arriving, making sure the projects were on budget and on time, while Gehry was chasing clients, giving lectures, chasing the wives of clients, there would never have been any Gehry. So it's this symbiotic relationship with someone architects know. Sometimes the partnership is unequal, but it is the unequal partnership which allows for the emergence of great works. So Greg, who died last year, was also a great source of anecdotes and also of useful information about the building when I was working on this book. So a brief Parisian episode, which is interesting. I will mention it very briefly. In 1961, thanks to a classmate of him at Harvard, Gehry spent 1 year in Paris. He worked with a forgotten architect called Remondet, who had been an assistant of Auguste Perret and was connected to America. He worked also for Robert Ozel, who is really better known. I think he even worked in Portugal at some point. Robert Ozel was a planner and a very sophisticated scholar of urban form who published this encyclopedia of city planning. So I think it taught Gehry quite a lot. And you see at the bottom right a plan for a housing estate Gehry did with Ozel. He also met a young architect called Anatole Kopp, who had studied at MIT, had been an instructor at Black Mountain College in the 40s, and had published a fundamental book on the Russian avant-garde in 1967. If I may say it, an avant-garde book on the Russian avant-garde, which was the first to really bring together images and analysis on constructivism, a book which was foundational, if I can use this term, for me as I was a student, and prompted me to work on Russia, maybe. But it's also a book which was read and very well absorbed by Rem Koolhaas at the same time, or by Kenneth Frampton. So the book was really important. Gehry met with Kopp. They shared the same politics. Kopp was a communist at that time. And there's an amusing anecdote told by Gehry, in which he, in Kopp, went at night to the Orly airport in Paris when a bunch of fascist generals had made a coup d'etat in Algiers and were threatening to send paratroopers to occupy Paris. So together with Kopp and a gun Kopp had found under his bed, Gehry went in a Citroën 2 chevaux to Orly to try to meet the incoming paratroopers. They never made, but the anecdote tells you something about Gehry's engagement and friendships at that time. He also, and it was really important in his trajectory, he also started going through France, looking at the work of Le Corbusier, and in particular the shocking chapel of Ronchamp, which has completely surprised the most Corbusianist supporters of Le Corbusier. And then he returned to Los Angeles without having a job and found some work with Gruen again, working on the new projects of Gruen. Gruen was a paradoxical guy. He had first contributed to the ruin of American downtowns by moving retail out to the shopping malls, and then he changed his position and went back to the centers and advocated the resurrection of urban centers with complex projects. So this is one in Rochester, New York, on which Gehry worked. Out of work, Gehry and Walsh also were given some little commissions by Groen, like this resort in southern Australia, a small Mediterranean village, in which we see this presence of picturesque design as learned by Gehry at Harvard. And with Ozel, Gehry was, for instance, a good reader of Camille Lozita's book on the artistic foundations of urban design, which had been translated into English after the war. Here we see and now we move into the first projects of the Walsh-Gehry partnership. Another photo, group photo, which is interesting, which shows us, it doesn't work. It shows us Gehry on the right holding the ball, and Walsh here, and a bunch. Debra Sussman, graphic designer, Jerry Cavanaugh, designer, and specialized in color schemes. We see the team which came out from the Victor Groen office and which remain in touch for many years later. So in this context, Gehry did a first extension of a house for a singing couple in Hollywood, and you see how Japanese it is if you look at the details. And finally, a first real significant building, which was a simple apartment house in Santa Monica, in which Gehry works at camouflaging with a tile roof the brutal orthogonal box called in Los Angeles the dingbat, which was then growing everywhere and replacing the low-rise bungalows. So this building is interesting from this typological point of view. Inside, it's also interesting because of the taste we see. We see Japanese features like this beam called ranma in Japanese. So it comes from the Japanese knowledge of Japan. Walsh had served as a military in Japan and knew Japan very well, better than Gehry. And then you see the Danish-inspired furniture on the ground. So it's a sort of interesting diagonal between Scandinavia and Japan on the Californian coast. The building still exists. Gehry was involved in it. It was developed with his family. A second project in which the Japanese connection emerges and is this office building for a branch of jewelry store, K Jewelers, also a commission received like the first one within the family circle through brother-in-laws, cousins, etc. And here you see this building with this facade ruled by columns which were made of concrete tubes, and the garden, which is completely Japanese. So this is Gehry 1.0 is clearly a Japanizing designer. This is also true of the interior. Look at the interior with the sliding partitions. What is also interesting is that K Jewelers had a branch of stores, and this is a new direction which appears then in Gehry's work and which is significant in his work till the present day, working with commerce. And this has had an impact even on his way of designing museums. A very good understanding of how to present objects, merchandise, and works of art. So this is what he had learned with Groen and what he developed, for instance, in this chain of little stores designing very sophisticated cabinetry. Here you see one of my favorite drawings published in the Complete Works. It's a large drawing in which you see clearly that it was made on both sides of a sheet of paper, probably by Greg, not probably, by Greg and Frank working on each side. So it's an example of their interaction and also the sense of detail they developed. So I'm trying in the book to tell the story of a project through the sequence of drawings, which is sometimes difficult. Okay, K. Jewelers. And then Gehry and Walsh established their studio in Santa Monica and start working for various types of clients. They develop here small office buildings in which sometimes they are tempted by certain minimalists. You could see a presence of what Kahn or Paul Rudolph are doing at the same time. It is a period of great uncertainty. And this is what I would call the period of soul searching. Gehry clearly doesn't know whom he wants to be and tries to identify with various directions in modern architecture, including here in this drawing, we see a project for the Californian deserts, a resort for Hauser, for a doctor called Benson, and a charlatan called Gaylord Hauser, who was selling pharmaceuticals and miracle diets in the pharmacies of the entire world at that time. Remember it from France. This is a resort which was largely inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's desert projects of the early 1920s. So one direction points to contemporary American architecture, another one to Wright, many different things. What will change takes place here when Gehry starts looking at the commercial architecture of Los Angeles. What Rainer Banham has called, well, not his term, but as mentioned in his book on Los Angeles, the dumb box. The dumb box, the dumb volume, which creates lines and lines of buildings alongside the main Los Angeles Avenue. So this project is a turning point. It was made for a small metallurgy workshop. It was, in fact, a vertical addition. And you see here the research which was made by Gehry on trying to shape the volume of the building and to reflect on the idea of a building which had no expression and can be considered as totally minimalist, but at the same time, a sort of elegant editing of the vernacular. So this building is now gone, but the following one is still standing, and it's a building which was a turning point for Gehry. The house and studio for the graphic designer Lou Danziger, who was then working for the newly created Los Angeles County Museum of Art. House and studio, which was published by Rainer Banham in his 1971 book. I advise you to read this book. It's an exemplary case of a monograph on a city, which is not a monograph on a city, but much more. And I knew Banham very well, and I read the book when it was published, and it took me 10 years to go from the book to the city. So I knew the book inside out, and I remembered this photograph of the Danziger house, published by Banham, who was saying that this was probably the first house in contemporary Los Angeles which was regaining what he called the angst, the anxiety of Schindler. So Banham, who had no particularly friendly relationship with Gehry, they didn't get along together very well, but Banham had spotted this house as being very important. So I've worked on the drawings of the Danziger house and studio, the work done at articulating the two components of the program, the relationship it might have been with the early modernist structures of Los Angeles, like, for instance, the Irving Gill Horatio Court on the upper right. Gehry worked at this building and ended up by building by creating a very interesting set of articulated volumes, which were interesting for at least two reasons. One, the minimalist cubistic shape of the exterior, which you can see here. He was interested at that time, he was beginning to be interested in the work of the minimalist sculptures. The building was finished not in the usual stucco made with plaster or cement, but with a projected coarse cement used, called the freeway mix, used for public works in Los Angeles. So it was another move into the direction of prosaic architecture, giving an elegant shape to prosaic Los Angeles architecture. And if you look at the drawing on the left, which is authenticated by both Gehry and Walsh, you see the interesting aspects in the interior. It's the fact that the roof structure in wood is left bare. So it's the beginning of an attitude in which Gehry will start to use the wooden structure, the wood frame of the otherwise called the balloon frame in the American West, will use it with freedom. And this is probably, besides the dumb box, the major contribution of LA's building culture to the work of Gehry. Here we see the exterior of photos I made. This is, I think, one of my earliest photos, a building which was immediately spotted by Los Angeles artists. I'm convinced that I should interview Hockney himself. That Hockney's work on the right is on Melrose Avenue, the avenue where this building used to stand and is still standing today. I'm convinced that Hockney, who knew Gehry, didn't miss it when he worked on this on this painting. And in the interior is really interesting because you see the exposed wooden structure and also the exposed ductwork, a sort of brutalist take at the systems, which is has to be related with Gehry's frequent presence in New York at that time and his interest for the artists' lofts of Soho, which were beginning to proliferate. So it's a New York interior in Los Angeles, which will determine many other developments of Gehry's work. It will also cement his friendship with the Los Angeles artists. Here, Ed Moses, a longtime friend who spotted the house in construction and took all his artist friends from the famous Ferrers Gallery to come see the building of Gehry. And Gehry developed, you see him at an opening at LACMA, the newly created Museum of Art, which is marked by Ed Ruscha, also a member of the same group of artists. This prompted Gehry to come closer to the artists. And the artists, for him, the artists played many roles. This group of Los Angeles artists, they were friends. He hung out with them. He was the nice architect who was paying the drinks because he had slightly more money than them. They were friends. They became sometimes clients. They produced the works he installed in exhibitions, works he collected, and in the end, they became role models for him. They inspired his way of doing architecture. So this connection with the artist is something very fundamental, and it is what took Gehry away from Los Angeles corporate culture. He broke with corporate culture. He broke with the obsession of relating to Kahn, Rudolph, or Le Corbusier, or Wright, and he found his way in contact with this society of artists. And this is also when another aspect of his work, this is also when he started installing exhibitions. And I think that the experience of the installations is something really fundamental also in the way he started imagining museums later. Here is the first show he ever installed at the County Museum on Japanese art, which was important for him for two reasons: the presence of Japan in his culture, but also the relationship with the museum. This is the plan of the circulations of this installation. This is another example of his connection with the museum, the work he did for Norton Simon, who was a major businessman and also a collector of art. He had a collection of sculptures, so Gehry installed, for instance, for LACMA, the backs of Matisse for Norton Simon. And he also frequently traveled to New York to see exhibitions. This one, Primary Structures at the Jewish Museum, was the first exhibition to propose minimalism as the term covering the work of an entire group of sculptors. And Gehry was very attracted by the work of Carl André, Lever on the right, which was said to have been ordered over the telephone. Then Carl André and Gehry met, and André said, no, it wasn't the case. But Gehry was, in a way, interested in the abstraction of his works. And here we see again the artists of the Ferrers Gallery with whom Gehry was befriended. And a very important moment in which Gehry works for LACMA, returns to the galleries of the County Museum to install a show by one of the Ferrers artists called Billy Al Bankston. You see on the left a painting by him, a little sketch, plan sketch of Gehry, where he seems on the right to be emulating the geometry of Bankston's painting. But the most important thing is what we see here. It is the use for the installation of discarded, existing, almost disgusting materials, bringing into the pristine world of the museum badly painted and stained plywood, rough corrugated steel was a sort of provocation. And it in a way, it condensed this early relationship of Gehry with the artist. Think of the combines of Rauschenberg at that time. Here is the interior of the Bankston show, which was absolutely essential in Gehry's understanding, not only of inexpensive materials, but of prosaic materials, which were not supposed to be the noble substances and products which were meant to be used in a museum environment. This drew him to take the same discourse outdoors with the first project in which he used corrugated steel, which was the hay barn for Dick O'Neill and his wife, Dick O'Neill, who was a prominent Democratic politician. And this is another aspect of the relationship of Gehry with Los Angeles, which is this closeness to the Democratic establishment, which yielded many commissions over the years. Through the network of the Los Angeles artists, Gehry, yes, this is a note which I found in the archive, interesting because it explains that much of what is Gehry used to build the barn, in particular the wood piles, had been found on the spot. So it's a sort of gigantic objet trouvé, which is reshaped using a kind of oblique roof, which had been borrowed again, probably for the last time from Frank Lloyd Wright. This led Gehry to work at a remarkable house for a painter called Ron Davis, who was also part of the same circle. So this is really here, even if Banham had published Danziger House, the Davis House was the house which attracted the attention of the East Coast architects to this unknown professional. The house was visited by Bob Stern, who told Philip Johnson to go see it, and Gehry was launched on the national scene by the house. Here we see early projects for house and studio, which were meant as a sort of mini village, but already we see inside the model on the bottom left, we see the idea of creating a set of boxes inside a large space. This is what, again, the New York artists were doing in their solo lofts, creating boxes for bathrooms, dark rooms when they were using photography or kitchens. So Ron Davis, like other American painters at that time, so Ellsworth Kelly here, was working on the perspectival illusion, and this is what, in a way, became the common language between Gehry and him. Gehry started working, as you see on the right, with this sort of fold-out drawing of a house at designing on the base of various perspectival angles what the house would be from different directions. So not an orthogonal box, but a box shaped by the view lines. And he did this by having models which and extending wires in order to simulate the perspectival angles. He did this, Davis, on the ground. And you see him working on the model on the top left with Davis and other people on the ground, and finally on the building site, which was made easy. And this is, again, the point I'm making about Los Angeles technology. He was able to undertake these geometric explorations thanks to the generosity of the wood frame, of the balloon frame. And here I would say that Gehry would never have developed in a culture of béton, never. He would not have had the guts and the ability, and also simply the economical ability to imagine what he has done. He's a son of the wood frame. And what is interesting is in these projects of the 70s until his own house, step by step, the wood frames is emancipated and becomes a protagonist, and in the end explodes the house itself. So this is very important here at Davis. Here we see the exterior in the hilly landscape of Malibu. The house has been since burned to the ground by one of the great fires in the last years. But you see how the corrugated steel has traveled. The migration of corrugated steel from the cellar, the basement of the museum, to the barn, where it was meant for hay and horses, to the artist's house. Inside the house, there were also very interesting ideas. Again, the idea of boxes inside the box, a visible roof, and the idea of evolution through time. All these walls were put on wheels and were meant to be displaced. It never happened. As you know, all the flexibility, system for flexibility are an illusion. Never works. What works is having space. When you have space, everything can happen. This is the lesson of Mies van der Rohe, having a vast enough space to do whatever you want and change it over time. So anyway, the house was really great, but Gehry and Davis didn't get along well. Davis claimed the credit for the entire project, and I wasn't able to get him for an interview. Another project in which the revolt of the wood frame continues, and I don't know where I'm going, is also related to the art scene. Again, we see the idea of a dumb box, the Los Angeles art scene, and the Los Angeles wood frame is the Gemini GEL building. Gemini was created by two very active collectors and business people to produce multiples. Gemini was the first firm which created multiples of sculptures. Prints, of course, are existing ever since the Renaissance, but to do multiples of sculptures of various types of artist objects. And Gehry worked with them. The first building on the left, which, sorry, you don't see it clearly, but it's interesting because it's related with a big billboard on the left. Then a second building, and what is really interesting is the articulation in which the stairs, the oblique stairs connecting the two buildings become visible, appears on the street. Appears on the street, let's go see here. So a frame is no longer a matter of interior, it becomes a matter of architectural affirmation on the outdoors. And this is the very moment in which Gehry expresses himself for the first time. A frustrating thing about Gehry is that there are almost no writing by Gehry. He has, as you know, Le Corbusier has left 75 projects, if we count Pessac and all the houses as one, and 45 books. Frank Lloyd Wright, maybe 40 books. Mies van der Rohe, 40 aphorisms. But Gehry has left probably four articles, less than 1 page each. So it's not, he has left thousands of letters, great letters, fantastic letters with clients. He used to be a great letter writer and still is, and he has given thousands of interviews, which are also a base for my research. I try to see what he says and also sometimes the contradictions, but how his statements changed since the early 80s. So this is one very clear statement in a national journal, the Architectural Record, a no rules architecture, and you see that the slogan is very clear. I search out the work of artists and use art as a means of inspiration. I try to rid myself of the burden of culture, and this is not true, and look for new ways to approach the work. I want to be open-ended. There are no rules, no right or wrong. I'm confused as to what's ugly and what's pretty. And this is a very clear statement of what he was doing at that time. He theorized it in another way in a lecture he gave at Rice University, showing a piece of cardboard which he had used for his furniture in the early 70s, which was another avenue he explored, but I can't talk about everything today. And you see here this term, provocative term, cheapskate architecture, which means the architecture, cheapskate means mean, someone who's stingy, who doesn't want to spend money. So it's an architecture, it could be called architettura povera, if you want. It's a cheapskate architecture. It's almost a sort of, I would say, dismissing kind of term. And this is what he continued to undertake, beginning also to work in another direction, which had started slightly with the Danziger project. Remember, the Danziger project played with 2 volumes and their articulation. Gehry started to thinking at this idea of fragmentation, dissociating the components of programs. Here, an unbuilt project for a gallery owner who, as you see on the right, was a great swimmer. You have this lap pool, which is an important part of the project. But the building is already decomposed in various volumes, which have each a particular surface treatment. Even more in this direction is another key unbuilt project for the Jung Institute, a bunch of psychoanalysts working in Western Los Angeles. They wanted a courtyard, a sort of bungalow courtyard, which you see on the left. This is a sketch by the client, with a pool and a monument to Jung in the middle. Gehry completely changed this and created a composition of freestanding volumes over a pool of water. In alluding, you see it here, you see the drawing on the top, which shows all these individual volumes situated on a big pond of water, an element which has very strong meaning in Jungian psychoanalysis. Water represents the unconscious. And of course, I compare it, this is easy, but for an old Corbu-maniac like me, difficult to resist. I compare it with the elementary volumes of Le Corbusier's Towards an Architecture, but it's a very important sketch. The idea that the building as a continuous entity is dissolved into an assembly of volumes. And here you see the views of the model, which have been kept. Gehry had already in those years a practice of experimental models, not to the degree he has reached today, where he made models where, in fact, this is an important problem for my project, where sketches have become sketch models, which changes really the perspective. And I will conclude with 2 projects in Santa Monica, which are both of them rooted in the culture of Los Angeles. Santa Monica Place is a shopping mall, so return to the culture of shopping malls of Gehry had learned at Groons. He had worked, and I can't discuss every single project he made between 1954 and the initial dual-use Rom house and his own house in 78, probably 70, at least there are 75 projects in the book. But these two projects in Santa Monica are meaningful. A shopping mall for the Rouse Corporation, for which he had worked in Maryland and built a series of very interesting structures. It started with a very grandiose shopping mall. You see the drawing on the left, which is clearly has to be situated in the culture of the 70s, where the magisterial book of Jonas Friedrich Geist on arcades, Passagen, had been published in German and translated into English. So here the parallel is tempting. And the building, in a way, shrunk. Santa Monica was a city where a local movement, a grassroots movement, was very strong. They cut the project, they reduced the project to 2 blocks instead of 6, and by the ocean. And here you see what Gehry did, which was conceiving the shopping mall as an arcade in diagonal, connecting the 2 big department stores and collecting the small stores. Here we see one of, so the interior design of the shopping mall is really important. Here we see another feature which is important. It's treatment of the south wall, facing the south, and the use of the super graphic, which can of course be connected with the Hollywood sign. Gehry has a lithograph of Rocher, still has, in which the Hollywood sign is running loose. So this culture of the billboard, of publicity of the American city at large, but of Los Angeles per excellence, is something which has prompted Gehry to make here a really strong statement about the building. The building as such is a sort of dumb box, or was, because it has been transformed widely, in which the message is carried by this. Another remark on this building, what is important is what you see on the right. It's a shopping mall, at least as it was, in which architecture was stronger than the brands. Usually, the architecture in a shopping mall is at the service, has to be the discrete servant of the brands. The brands are on the fourth stage, and architecture is in the back. Here, the architectural structuring of the space was really very important. Okay, now the second project in Los Angeles was Gehry's own house. Gehry didn't have much money to build a house, yet he wanted to make a statement, clearly, like Schindler, Neutra, Lautner, the Eameses, etc. Every significant architect has left a mark and had used the construction of his or her house as an advertisement. Gehry wanted to do the same thing. He had no money, so he bought a very modest bungalow in the center of Santa Monica and started ripping it away and transforming it, making a very strong statement in the direction of what he has called cheapskate architecture. So here you see the first sketches in which maybe the first one is here and is on the left, rather unexpected. You see here the wrapping of a sort of wall system around the bungalow, which brings to mind Alto's Finnish pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. Gehry had forgotten this sketch. He was surprised because I'm trying systematically to grill him on every sketch I publish. Sometimes he remembers something, sometimes he doesn't. So at least we see here this first idea. Second idea on the right is the putting the Davis House volume on the knees of another volume. And then he developed, by cutting away literally the model, the house was developed into something completely different and original. There are also interesting parallels which I think had never been made before. The parallel with the celebrated house Robert Venturi built for his mother. And look, it's really interesting. You have in both cases a sort of vertical slot in the center, which comes, as we know, in Venturi's work from Moretti's Casa del Girasole in Rome. Look, there is a long window on the right and a square window on the left. This is not a coincidence. Gehry has denied having had anything to do with Venturi after the explosion of postmodernism, but he was clearly knowledgeable about Bob's work. So I don't want to enter in many details. There are also connections with Rauschenberg's huge combination works called explicitly combines of found materials, of ready-mades. I remind you, but you probably don't know it, it's a rhetorical expression. I would mention one interesting historical fact. Apropos objet trouvé, the first ever monographic exhibition of Marcel Duchamp, first ever, had taken place in '63 in Pasadena, Los Angeles, and had been seen by Gehry. So this connection with Duchamp, direct and indirect through the work of Rauschenberg, was important. Also, of course, the relationship with Mata Clark. Mata Clark, Gehry always said he had no clue about his work, but I found a letter in the Mata Clark archive about Mata Clark's agent saying that a Los Angeles architect by the name of Frank Gehry was interested in his work. So, in fact, and then Mata Clark died. He died, so it never happened. But so anyway, the house is also is connected with the artists. Here we see the development of the project, most notably the work on the big skylight, which is represented by Gehry as if it were going to fall down from the house onto the sidewalk. So there is something about animation. And there is something about, and this is here a model in which we see that models were really research instruments to try to understand the geometry of all these components. The house as it was finished. And here, yes, the building site, which shows us this time really what I would call the revolt of the wood frame. Without the wood frame, the house would not have existed. But the wood frame itself, as you see on this view, for instance, is emerging out, is blowing out the house, is coming out. The house is therefore, and this was the modest and a little, I would say, unpolished thesis I had in my article of 1981. The house is as much a manifesto on Los Angeles building culture as made of wood, plywood, corrugated wood, chicken wire, etc., as the Eames house was a manifesto about the wartime culture of metal, of steel and aluminum. This is also this manifesto quality which is noticeable here. And inside, where of course all the paneling has been taken out. You see, by the way, on the fireplace on the right, the Rocher drawing of the Hollywood sign. Here, the kitchen, which is probably encapsulates probably the attitude of Gehry. You see the existing house on the left, the window transformed into a piece of furniture, and the use of the margin between the house and the sidewalk in order to build the kitchen, which prompted Philip Johnson, who had become a very good, staunch supporter of Gehry, to ask Frank one day, Frank, I don't understand if I am in your kitchen or if I am eating on the sidewalk. So, good. Building site accidents were also a factor. Improvisation was also something that made, accentuated the parallel with the work of Rauschenberg, of making of a work which is a process in which nothing is pre-planned. Rauschenberg's combines were not fully drawn on paper. They were made as a process. This is also what happens sometimes. Gehry suddenly found that a window was too interesting not to be kept as a bathroom closet. A handyman threw a worker threw a hammer through a wall, and it created a hole. The hole was framed and became a window. So the process in itself was really interesting. It has to be said also that Gehry at that moment was beginning to be working with a younger generation, and was beginning in his office and outside the office training people, and so that the relationship he had with Los Angeles was also one of completely changing the ideal of the emerging profession, of taking away, creating an alternative ideal to the dominating ideal of the corporate firm of Brun, which was still continuing, A.C. Martin, and other big Los Angeles, Pereira, and other Los Angeles firms. Gehry's practice became a model. In particular, as he changed his, as he reoriented his practice around 1980, and this is one of the two conclusions I want to make. Around 1980, Gehry had a conversation at dinner with an official. This is a super well-known anecdote, but worth recalling. And this official of the Rouse Company, the developer of the Santa Monica Mall, asked him, Frank, tell me, what is really the architecture you want to do? Is it the shopping mall or your house? You seem to have much more fun doing your house. You should make a choice. And Gehry thought about it, and on the following Monday, got rid of 75% of his staff and focused essentially on experimental projects. So the visible conflict between the fact of doing intelligently and critically commercial project and doing only personally engaging projects, this shift took place at that time. Also at that time in which Gehry was hitting the world's scene. Gehry becomes international. He gets a first cover story of Domus in 1980 and finds maybe his most perceptive critics and observers in the European critics. I will only, as a coda, read this piece by Mendini in Domus, which I think is revealing. Architecture for you seems to be more like a warehouse of scenes, just like the scenes in a theater where bits of Mozart, Stravinsky, Vivaldi, and Gershwin are jumbled together. This is the only way I can explain why a house of yours seems to be made like a heap of pieces, all on top of and inside each other, where elements of Gropius and Kahn, Barragan, and Waxman interpenetrate. I don't see all of them, but I believe these recent works of yours are important. Their hyper-realist action carried on the unfinished, the provisional, then the semi-processed industrial product. Their demonstrative synthesis applied to the chaos of current building. They're a counterpoint both to the modern movement and to hyper-technical construction. Extremely well said. And the next step, 1980, or exactly the same moment, was the moment in which Bob Stern had Gehry invited to the Venice Biennale of 1980, the legendary and infamous Biennale where the slogan of the postmodern was proposed by Portoghesi. And what is really revealing is what Gehry did at the Biennale. No one understood it. It went completely, everyone considered it was a silly game on which had nothing to do with the obsession of all the 19 other participants with historicists, with one exception. In fact, there were two rebels in the Strada Novissima. One was Kohlhaas, who was referring to Malevich and other modernist shapes. So Kohlhaas was one, and the other one was Gehry. What did he do? He built a Los Angeles wood frame between two columns of the Venice Arsenale. Framing columns, what were they doing? They were not a facade as such. They were meant to frame a perspective looking at the windows and at the outside facade of the building. So they were the only, Gehry's contribution was the only one which was really contextual, which was looking at the place saying, don't look for history in Vignola, look for history where it is around you. Thank you.
If there is any comment or question in the public. If not, I can start just asking something. Well, it has to do with not precisely with the period that you have been telling us about, but something that you suggested in your lecture that had to do with this, for example, because Gehry just changed from models, for example, to digital models. And in fact, as your research has been mostly based on drawings, how do you think, of course, that probably that makes your life a bit more difficult, the passage to the digital world, but also for Frank Gehry, how do you think that it changed his architecture and his way of relating with the process?
Yes. No, this would be another lecture. The digital turn, Gehry was questionably a pioneer, although it started very early. I found a 3D computer model done by one of his clients called John Whitney around 1980. I found Polaroids of this model, so something was in the air. But the digital turn for Gehry was born out of frustration. He had contractors who didn't know how to draw, how to build the forms he had made on paper or in a model. So in a way, one of his collaborators, and it came out probably with the fish, the project for the fish in Barcelona. The fish is, as you know, the fish is aerodynamic or hydrodynamic, is changing multiple dimensions, curvilinear dimensions, multiple curvatures, very difficult easy to build in a model, very difficult then to reproduce and to produce. And one of the guys in the office said, well, why don't you go and see how boats are made? And then one said, no, rather go to the way airplanes are made. So that's when he went to CATIA, to Dassault Systems and the software used for airplane making, but without ever touching a computer himself, using the computer to rigorously interpret the shapes in order to define the dimensions and even in some case produce them industrially. So computer became a tool, but Gehry has the design, there is no single project since which had been started of a computer. The computer comes in as an instrument, as a tool for the definition of, the detailed definition of works to be done. So I will show some computer drawings, but only as additional evidence. For me, the center of the reflection remains how Gehry worked. Of course, there is now the question of collective work. The office is an office with dozens of people, but still Gehry has what is really touching is that he has a personal presence in the office. He's the one he continues to be there at 8 in the morning at the age of 94 years, breaking the model the day before, saying it's no good, I'll redo it. So he's still in a sort of anxious state in respect to the invention of projects and working still on models, on gigantic urban models or on detailed models, on doing many models for a single building, because as he has said once, if I make only one model, I start making a confusion between the building and the model. I need that to have various scales and various types in order to keep the idea that it's about the building, but not the building. So, and of course, at some point, models, paper models in particular, or wooden models, become sketches. Gehry, deep inside, and this would be also another lecture, is a functionalist. He's someone who doesn't engage in the sculptural development of his projects without having resolved the basic functional issues. So in a way, deep inside, he's a boring American professional. He tries to solve the problems, to put the bathrooms where they have to be, to put the right light, to connect the correctly the spaces in sequence, doing it always. The method is very clear with wooden blocks. So you start by piling wooden blocks, then you redoes it 100 of times, and then start wrapping an envelope around them, and goes back to the volume. So it's an iterative project in which there can be some computerized moments, but basically the work is solved on the model. So what kind of book can I do with that? Big mystery. I can do a book with photos of models and sequencing the photos of the model photos. And I should have brought you, but it's too late, views of the 6,000 square meters warehouse where Gehry has the bulk of his archive now, and where you have thousands of fragments of models, pieces of Bilbao, pieces of the Lewis house, which were all moments in the development of the project. So it's an extremely proliferating and complex operation in which Gehry, of course, has not shaped things by his own fingers. Sometimes he does, but has had a very close intervention. So at some point, it will become a catalogue raisonné of sketch models, and with some loops in which drawing returns as a major medium of research and interpretation.
Very good. Is there any other question? Yes.
Please.
Hello. Two questions. One very quick. To know, where did you publish that 1981 article about America?
Yes, it was published in AMC, which was the then one of the French little magazines, to say it with Beatrice Colomina. And strangely, I've lost the issue. So I have it somewhere as a Xerox, but I will look for it and will send it to Marta. Yes.
Thank you.
It's very modest. You have to realize that I was very young and naive at that time. I'm still naive, but I'm a bit older.
And the second, you spoke about different ways to enter the head of Frank Gehry, or the thinking. And you said that he didn't publish articles or texts. You mentioned 4 texts. And you also mentioned the study of letters as a source of research.
Yes.
And I wanted to know more about what you think about the possibility to study an architect through the study of letters.
Through is?
The study of letters, of the
exchanging
of, yeah.
Well, there are no good or bad methods. The major thing in research, you need 2 things. You need ideas and materials. There is no good research with materials only, no good research with ideas only, at least in this field which is the one you seem to be working in. So I think the letters as such, as a medium which has its own rules, so you can study the rhetorical dimension of letters, what letters say about the relationship between people. At some point, there will be a limit. Unless you want to, it's research in literary history, in the history of architectural literature. At some point, there's a limit. The letters refer to something else, to people, to buildings, to sites, to experiences. So there's just so much you can do. And of course, what is fundamental, and the good thing is that Gehry is still around and I can ask him some questions, is the oral dimension of the history of contemporary architecture. And it requires a particular training an experience. If you interview people without being prepared, you get nothing. They repeat the same thing, unless you really they like you and start or have had a couple of glasses and become lyrical. But you get what you deserve in an interview. You need to come prepared with often with materials you put on the table to inspire. Oh, you did this drawing in 1974. Oh, you remember this building? So it's a sort of complex relationship in which experiences of ethnographic work are very important. You have to bring gifts to the people you interview. You can't only steal the memories from them. So I think the study of psychology and ethnography is important if you want to work with living. Also study your own engagement. So that's why the letters are great, but if you have nothing but letters, use the letters. If you can access living beings, it's much more interesting.
Well, I don't know if there is any other.
Yes, here in the back.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. It was a very beautiful lecture. And I think it was very important for a lot of us that don't have all of that or a very deep knowledge about Frank's work to sort of reposition him in the whole scheme of things. I think we tend to associate him with a lot to the expressionist sort of attitude of architecture. And that sort of leads me to the question, which is, you left us at quite a cliffhanger, because we have explored his the first few buildings that he was building that were very much informed by Japanese architecture and the craft of building with wood, and then to the dumb boxes, to his own house, where he sort of defined this economy of means that also defied the idea that architecture is very much dependent on the industry of construction and fabrication. And my question would be then, where or when and how or why does this sort of tight link to then afterwards more expression or more expressive of an architecture that explores its sort of more expressionism look come from? Like, how does this? Sorry if my question was not very clear, but so how can we then link sort of where we stop now to, let's say, the Bilbao Guggenheim, which is sort of more exuberant?
The links are the life of someone, and there are jumps. There are moments in which things change. So, for instance, the work Gehry started doing with fish in the early 80s, which will be a part of the story of Volume 2. So maybe when Volume 2 is out, I can give a second lecture and one for Volume 3. So we'll have a program for the next 25 years. Fish has very origins. As always, it's part of it is mythical. Gehry says, my grandmother in Toronto used to have carps, fish in her bathtub in order to make one of typical Eastern Jewish dishes, which is stuffed fish, gefilte fish. It's one aspect. The other one is connected with Gehry's take at postmodernism. He resisted the label of postmodern completely and said, well, if they want to go back to the Renaissance, I will go back to the tertiary age and fish, which were the first living beings. So I'll outsmart you by 300 million years. And then he started to work at fish. At the same time, he's pragmatically made fish out of pieces of plastic he was working on to make furniture. So there are a series of reasons. At some point, I think fish, and he was using fish in his drawings as a sort of placeholder for the projects of the 80s. When he didn't know exactly what shape to put in a given system of volumes, he would put a fish. And And the fish, the shape of the fish was, of course, streamlined, curvilinear, very different from everything rather orthogonal or oblique, at least simple geometries we've seen so far. So I think in the process, the fish started to contaminate his way of thinking and introducing curved lines. The first project which really introduced a more, you could say, expressionist or expressive or approach was the Vitra Design Museum around 1987. Then it changed to Walt Disney Concerto. The first project was horrible, but he won the competition with it. And then he started redoing it in a more flexible way. The Lewis House was fundamental, on which he worked. Peter Lewis House, meant to be built in Ohio, on which he worked for 5 years, and which was also one of the projects for which computers were introduced, was also a fundamental load for a fundamental shift. If we look at the early drawings and the later ones, it's one of these watershed projects. So there is no clear before and after. There is no single project when you can say it happens. It happens as often in a series of unrelated moves and changes, which in the end have a cumulative effect, and this cumulative effect can be called Bilbao.
Another question. You said that Frank Gehry refused the label of postmodernists.
Yes.
And it was very interesting to know that Kulas and Gehry was, as you called, rebels in that exhibition in Venice. But 8 years later, in MoMA, they were both part of the deconstructivist exhibition. How do you relate? He was conscious and he accepted the label of deconstructivist.
No, Gehry didn't accept the label deconstructivist. He accepted to be shown at MoMA. So he was happy to be there. At the same time, a little distant and jealous and envious in respect to the others. But he and Koolhaas were really, well, Koolhaas had a relationship from the beginning. Of course, you're aware that Koolhaas's first published essay on architecture was about Leonidov in '74 in opposition to Koolhaas. And I happened to have met Koolhaas in the '70s because he came to see me because he knew I was going to Moscow, was speaking Russian, and he wanted to have information about Leonidov's family. So Koolhaas had a definite relationship not with deconstructivism, which I think is an intellectual fake, but with constructivism, or at least with the Russian avant-garde. Gehry had also a certain relationship, which is interesting. He had designed in 1980 a very important exhibition at LACMA on the Russian avant-garde, which had very interesting pieces. And he had used, there is one of his projects of the same moment. By the way, this was the project MoMA brought, and the only model of Gehry which is owned today by MoMA. The house is called the Familian House, and it's a house in which it's not totally clear, but in which there seems to be some Malevich and some Lyubov Popova. So, and of course, in the language of the revolted wood frame. So it could be seen as a sort of mannerist and provocative take at constructivism. But this show of 88 was really very strange, contradictory and manipulative episode, which would deserve more attention another day.
So we already have here a promise of coming back. So I will finish with this.
One for everybody.
Many thanks.
Thank you.